So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation about the upcoming U.S. presidential election and what it means for the rest of the world. I'm Evan Lieberman. I direct the Center for International Studies, and I'm a professor of political science here at MIT. So today's Starr Forum features experts who will discuss the upcoming American election from the perspective of citizens, elites, and the media in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. So we've asked all of them to consider a few questions. They'll answer as many of them as they decided to, including what's at stake for these countries and regions? Is America still seen as a model for democracy around the world? How do these regions view our candidates? And what will the impact of the election be on their regions? So while Americans are very much focused on how this election will affect us, we wanted to widen the aperture beyond our nation's borders and try and capture a sense of how the world is seeing our country. America, of course, remains a critically important actor in the global arena, economically, politically, militarily, and culturally. And I hope that today's presentation's discussion will provide some insights and provoke some productive dialogue. And I know that none of when we talk about big world regions and we've given them only 12 minutes each, they're not going to capture the full views of the entire region. Some of them may choose to focus on just one country, but I'm really curious to hear what they have to say, and I've been looking forward to this event for a while. So as is our custom, we're first going to hear from the speakers, and then the speakers and I are going to join each other up on stage for some conversation. And then we're going to conclude with a Q&A for those of you who are here today. And so for the Q&A portion, please be mindful that we want to get in as many questions as possible. So please have just one question ready, and I ask you for a question. Sometimes there's that fine line between question and comment, but we're asking for a question. And when it comes time, I'll just ask you to line up behind those microphones in the aisle, and if you choose to do so, to introduce yourself and your affiliation. For those of you who might be celebrating the Jewish New Year, which begins at sunset, I wish you a Shana Tova, and we certainly understand if you need to duck out early. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our terrific speakers. I'm going to give a very brief bio. They're all very impressive individuals, and I encourage you to check out their websites. First, Katrina Burgess is an expert on Latin America, and she's professor of political economy and director of the Henry Leir Institute of Migration and Human Security at the Fletcher School at Tufts, and she's going to speak first. Daniel Ziblatt, focusing on Europe, is the director of Harvard's Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and he is the Eaton Professor of Government, and he's going to speak second. John Gatango, who will speak on Africa, currently resides at the Center for International Studies. He's our prestigious Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow, and has had a career as a journalist and as a leading anti-corruption advocate. And Prerna Singh, our final speaker discussing Asia, is the Mahatma Gandhi Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown. So our speakers are each going to have 12 minutes from the podium, and after that, we'll return to their seats, and then again, we'll all join one another up here on stage. So please join me in welcoming Katrina Burgess to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for coming on this beautiful fall day. So I'm going to talk about Latin America, a view from Latin America, and I'm going to start out a bit unconventionally with an audio clip. So let me tell you what happened, and then I'll explain why I've started with this particular audio clip. So the song that you just heard a little snippet of is originally a classic song by a Mexican band called Maná, and they did a remix with a reggaeton or artist who's Puerto Rican Dominican named Nicky Jam. Maná is from Guadalajara, which is a major city in Mexico, but has a decades-long record of strong support for migrants and pro-immigration policy. Nicky Jam was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, not too far from here, moved to Puerto Rico as a kid, and then relocated to Colombia. Well, last month, as this photo shows, Nicky Jam appeared at a Trump rally in Las Vegas and expressed his strong support for Trump and his campaign. In response, Mana wrote on Instagram that it does not work with racists and would pull the song from online platforms. So the reasons I found this story relevant to what I'm going to present today are threefold, at least. One, the US election is also polarizing in Latin America. Two, the Latin American diaspora plays an increasingly important role in US electoral politics. And three, this controversy, I think, is emblematic of the increasingly fluid identities and politics in the Americas. So with that, I'm going to turn initially to some very broad data on public opinion vis-a-vis the two rival platforms and candidates. And I'm going to start with the view from the diaspora, because again, I think you really can't disconnect the two, certainly in this day and age. So first of all, in terms of candidate preference, you can see from the chart on your left that people of Latin American descent are more favorable toward Harris, less favorable toward Trump than the otherwise US electorate, but the margin is narrowing, right? There's a sizable chunk of support for Trump, particularly among Cubans, but also increasingly among Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and other members of the Latin American diaspora. And I think the other categories is especially notable because we're seeing a significant increase in non-Mexican immigrants in the United States. So I think in the future, this may be a sign of a trend, and it's really pretty even for those who are from other countries in Latin America. The other thing that I wanted to kind of illustrate with this slide is how they stand on a particularly salient issue in the election. But interestingly, it's not the most salient issue for those polled that produced these results. The top issues, like for most people, were the economy, cost of living, and only 24% of those polled cited immigration as one of the top three issues. However, when they commented on immigration, there was a clear split, very high levels of trust in Harris for preserving and expanding legal pathways for Latin American immigrants, and much less trust on the issue of border security. In fact, they trust Trump more than Harris. Again, kind of consistent with the broader electorate. So now let's go south of the border and take a brief look at some public opinion findings with regard to at least a few countries in Latin America. And this is from a larger study done by the Pew Research Center of 34 countries. I'm highlighting the 6 countries that they included from Latin America. And as you can see here on the left-hand graph, the question is, do you have trust in the US, in this person to do the right thing regarding world events? And Biden, this was before he stepped down as the candidate, Biden doesn't do all that well, right? He does better than Trump in these Latin American countries, but also in general across the 34 countries. It's pretty split as to whether people trust Biden and perhaps by extension Harris to do the right thing in world affairs. Trump does terribly, right? And I'm sure we're going to be hearing this again when people talk about some of the other regions. And really, something that jumps out for me here is Mexico, right? 12% of Mexicans, according to this poll, trust that Trump would do the right thing in world affairs. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be the case. So at the same time, the Latin American views are not that far from the median, right? There are some differences when you look at the other regions, but generally they're not really that far apart from other parts of the world. The second public opinion result I'm going to share is what they think about US democracy, and I found this really fascinating. And so the 3 categories are: the green is that it's a good example for other countries to follow. The tan is that it used to be a good example, but not anymore. And the blue is that it was never a good example. And you can see that a plurality of respondents think the US is no longer a good example of democracy for the rest of the world to follow. This is quite disturbing. And Mexico, once again, has the smallest share that think that the US is a good model of democracy to follow, but it cuts across these different countries, and again, pretty consistent with the median, right, across 34 countries from several different regions. So this suggests that something has been going on that is making people in Latin America, if not the world, not too confident in either candidate, but also in US democracy. So now I want to turn for the last part of my talk to some of the policies and the policy implications of the different platforms for the countries of Latin America. And I will attempt to do this in the very short amount of time I have. So first, a broadly kind of quick historical context. Latin America is a key economic and security partner of the United States. It always has been. There are neighbors. We've been intertwined for centuries. And yet, it doesn't get much attention. And one scholar years ago coined this as benign neglect. So it's a benign neglect punctuated by security threats. So in the Cold War, it was communism and the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, it was the drug trade. And since 9/11, it's really been migration and the border. This is the security threat that we need to pay lots of attention to. Otherwise, Latin America doesn't show up in the news or really in policy conversations. So is this still true? Is this true in the 2024 campaigns? Yes. Latin America does not appear in the platforms of either candidate, except when they're talking about immigration or the US-Mexico border, which has become a very salient issue for all voters in the United States. I think even more so in this election than maybe ever in history. And I'll just note that Mexico just recently became our top trading partner, right? Brazil is the 9th largest exporter to the United States. It doesn't match on the ways in which Latin America is significant, but this is how US policy has tended to sort of consider Latin America and be formulated toward Latin America. So let me go through 3 buckets of policy very quickly. I'm not going to read everything on the slide. You can read it while I'm speaking. So for Harris on trade, investment, and climate, the Harris administration, I think, will probably be quite consistent. With the Biden administration, you're likely to see a further expansion in all 3 things, including continued and maybe increased support for the green energy transition in Latin America, which has a number of oil-producing countries, a lot of potential for green energy that will be supported. I think not just about economics, though. It's partly about migration, addressing root causes, and partly about competing with China. Mostly positive for Latin American economies, at least on the sort of in the aggregate level, but may be likely to intensify conflict in mining regions, particularly indigenous communities in the Andes, because we need minerals to fuel the green energy transition. Trump, total opposite. If he actually carries out some of the policies threatening, for example, the across-the-board 10 to 20% tariff on all imports, this could be devastating for Latin America, very dependent on exports to the United States. He's most likely would try to use the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now the USMCA, as leverage to get Mexico to crack down even more on immigrants. He did that in his previous administration. Some worry that free trade agreements could fall apart. And if they do, then this tariff would really more widely affect Latin America. And then I think his policies would sort of empower pro-fossil fuel factions within Latin American governments, right? So in terms of tipping the balance of who has the upper hand, it could affect that. Another bucket of issues is democracy and human rights. So for Harris, it'll be part of their foreign policy agenda. I think they'll be quite willing to use at least soft power and carrots to resist democratic backsliding and human rights abuses, both of which are quite rampant in the region. But if push comes to shove, I think migration control will take priority, particularly over human rights defense. Trump, again, kind of the opposite. No real commitment to either of these things. It's kind of a realpolitik, but guided by domestic agendas and domestic politics. So everything, I think, will be aligned with the objectives of stopping migration and sustaining his anti-communist credentials, which is part of the why he's so popular among key diaspora constituencies in the United States, those who come from left-wing autocrats who are sort of painted with the broad brush of being communist. And so I think there'd be preference of sticks over carrots, really no guardrails on would-be autocrats, particularly from the right. And I'll close with my minute and a half left with my favorite topic, which I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A, which is borders on migration. So just to note, the migratory landscape in Latin America has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. The US response has been largely reactive and ineffective. In that context, Harris has moved increasingly, Biden and Harris, toward being tough on borders and asylum for all sorts of political reasons. I think that will continue, but much more supportive of legal pathways. However, they're severely limited by congressional inaction. So there's only so much they can do in that direction. Trump, much harsher measures all around. And I think this could have, if he carries out some of his promises, like mass deportation, which I don't think he can actually do, but he may well try, this could have seriously negative effects in terms of social dislocation, in terms of reduced remittances, which are essential to particularly communities, but also countries' bottom line. And I think, the highly toxic rhetoric that we've been hearing will just persist, and I suspect that's a big part of the reason why Trump has such a negative reputation in Latin America is because the way he talks about people from Latin America, Latin American countries, et cetera. So I will close there. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I have some slides as well. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about European perceptions, and I'm drawing on a little bit of the same data, the Pew data that we just heard about. I'm going to make three broad, so how do I move the slides? Oh, this, right? Is that what this is here? Okay, sorry. Three broad things. I first just want to give a little context to the European-American relationship, transatlantic relationship, as it's often called. And then dig in a little bit into some of the data that I've come across as well. So the first thing I guess I wanted to say is, what unites the transatlantic world? At a very general level, there was this political scientist at MIT for many years, Karl Deutsch, who used this phrase, the North Atlantic community. And I think that actually describes something that's still very real, the sense through World War II, the Cold War, the post-Cold War world, that there is a community, a kind of self-conscious collective identity, that this is a part of the world that is committed to democracy, free markets, human rights. So that's still pretty robust. What that also means, though, is that there's a set of parallel and shared challenges to that self-conception in Europe and in the United States. And those are really centered around the emergence of radical right demagogic political parties. And so the emergence of anti-immigrant radical right parties that are often anti-democratic is around 30%. Usually these kinds of parties gain around 30% of the electorate. If you look at the recent elections in East Germany, around 30% of the votes went to the radical right AfD. In France, in the Netherlands, this is a kind of constant almost, a sociological constant. And if you look at the core of the MAGA base in the United States, that's also around 30% of the American electorate. And so this is a commonality, and this represents a kind of parallel challenge in all of these societies. Lying behind that are also a shared set of challenges that are in part driving, I think, this process. And what I think of as really driving these, both in North America and in Western Europe in particular, are this kind of triple cocktail of forces, economic declines in economic growth, increased ethnic diversity due to immigration, technological changes of changed media landscape. All of these things provide incredibly powerful raw materials for demagogues. And so in many ways, I think this challenges facing our democracies are very similar. So that's the kind of broad context uniting the transatlantic world. What divides the transatlantic world, I think, comes out of both the COVID experience and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in particular, I think what those two events did is exposed not only the global weight of the United States, but a kind of asymmetric dependence of Europe on the United States. And in particular, I would say that the kind of arrival of COVID meant, and I have pictures here, I think. The arrival of COVID exposed three vulnerabilities, and each of these pictures represent one of those vulnerabilities. The first being the kind of breakdown of supply chains exposed the degree to which Europe had outsourced its manufacturing, even more so than the United States, outside of Europe. And this represented a vulnerability to Europe. A second vulnerability exposed during the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the degree to which Europe had outsourced its energy production outside of Europe, in particular its reliance on Russian oil. In 2022, 60% of European Union's energy sources were from outside of Europe, and increasingly also now on the United States. And so that's a second kind of outsourcing that exposed a vulnerability. And then the third outsourcing, exposed also by COVID, or rather by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is the outsourcing of national security to the United States in particular. And of course, NATO is important, but the U.S.'s outsized role in all of this meant that there kind of was an exposure to, a kind of realization to a degree that hadn't been there before, that Europe was increasingly dependent on both in terms of security, in terms of economics, in terms of energy, on actors outside of their own borders. And in particular, the U.S. as a geopolitical heavyweight, there's this sort of sense of vulnerability. And also what this means, I think, is that increasingly there's a sense that Europe is vulnerable to what happens in the United States. And so another way to put this is that when democracy gets into trouble in a small country, it's often very tragic for the people living in the small country. But when democracy gets into trouble in a very big country, this has global reverberations. And I think Europeans are acutely aware of this. There's one other thing that has added a kind of particular nervousness, I would say, to European leaders, and that is the uneven economic developments in Europe versus the United States since COVID, so the sort of post-COVID economic recovery. And what's very clear is that both in terms of inflation, in terms of unemployment, in terms of annual GDP growth rates, the U.S. has thrived in the Biden era in comparison to Europe. And European state leaders, European CEOs are acutely aware of this and very jealously and sort of frustratingly look to what's happening in the United States. And the kind of common understanding of this is that Biden, by having spent so much money, federal spending and the infrastructure bill and so on, this kind of willingness to run up debts that European governments either are not capable of doing or not willing to do, have hamstrung European economies. And so European, again, CEOs and business leaders and political leaders look to what's happening, and sort of this adds this an increased sense of vulnerability. So you add all of this together, and again, Europeans, I think, are increasingly worried about what's happening in the United States. So what are Europeans thinking about? So on the one hand, as I said, there's a kind of jealous look at the American economy. The American economy is thriving, and there's this paradox that at exactly the moment the American economy is thriving, there's a real sense that American politics is unraveling, and this is what makes people so nervous. So I pulled together some of the same data, but some other sources, and this is just using UK to begin with. I mean, there's kind of majorities in favor of Harris. This is, I think, taken pretty recently, August 2024. Who think that the best outcome, this is not unique at all, Great Britain is not unique at all. If you look at Germany, you even get more striking, overwhelming support, Germans for Harris over Trump. You might wonder, well, who is it in that little red category there that's supporting Trump in Germany? And so if you kind of dig into it a little bit and just look by party, what you see, the Green Party supporters, SPD Socialists, the FDP is the Liberal Party, CDU, the BSW is a new party on the far left. But the most prominent support comes from the AfD, which is the radical right party. So this is pretty interesting because I think very much mirroring what we just heard, there's a way in which polarization domestically is being reflected internationally, and that people on the radical right in Germany and elsewhere in Western Europe, as we'll see here, see Trump as an ally. And these are the only ones in Germany who really like the Trump movement. We see something very similar, and I should just say one other thing about this. The AfD mimics Trump's rhetorical techniques, tries to break taboos, break norms, and so on. So it very much kind of follows in Trump's mold. We see very similar things in Poland. There's large pluralities favoring Harris. One exception, at least in this particular poll, is young people, as you see here. And this is, this may just be this particular poll, but I think there's something more general going on here. In recent elections in Western Europe and Germany, just in the regional elections in the last month, one of the things that's very striking is that the radical right does best among people in their early 20s. And so I think this is a phenomenon that political scientists really, to my mind, haven't really sufficiently explained systematically. I mean, we can think of all sorts of reasons why this might be the case, but this finding seems to kind of accord with that. The one big exception to all of this is Hungary, the one country where an authoritarian populace has been in power since 2010. And so maybe it's not so surprising. Overall, you see here that people who are satisfied with Orban, so the incumbent prime minister who's an ally of Trump's, are overwhelmingly supportive of Trump, and the anti-Orban opposition is against Trump. And again, you see this kind of mirroring of polarization where the kind of national polarization gets reflected in these assessments of international dynamics. And in some ways, this is then what this suggests is that Trump knows what he's doing when he invites Viktor Orban to Mar-a-Lago, and Orban gets invited to the conservative, I forget what the organization is, where the conservatives come together in the United States, and he's kind of treated as a model. So each side regards each other as a model. Final thing I wanted to deal with was, well, actually, here, this is just some more data. I'm sorry, this is more data. Basically, we see there's sort of generally lack of confidence. This reinforces the general trend that we were just talking about. This is also now from the same Pew data. So this is nice that we can compare this on sort of this sense of what do you think about American democracy? One way of looking at this is only in Poland is American democracy perceived as being a really good example, perceived as particularly poorly in Germany. And again, I would echo the same point. That's the sort of question that, may be a function a bit of the question, but it's interesting to see that, that many Europeans think the U.S. used to be a good example. And so all of this reflects, I think, this core reality. And I think the fact that we're seeing this both from Latin America as well as from Europe is that there is a way in which, America has experienced democratic backsliding. I mean, this is not in people's imagination. The U.S. has gone from a Freedom House score in 2016 of 94 to 83, which puts the U.S. on par with Romania and 2 points behind Argentina. And so people are actually looking at something and seeing something that's happening that's real. And so what all of this leaves us, and I have just 2 minutes left, I kind of want to make the point that this increasingly leaves Europeans really in a bind. Because Trump has threatened to leave NATO, or there's kind of the idea that he might leave NATO, that he has strong allegiances to Putin. I don't know if you saw the press conference with Zelensky the other day when he was asked, what he said something. I have very good friendship with Putin, and Zelensky standing right next to him said, "Well, I hope you have a stronger relationship with me." And he said, didn't really confirm that. But what this means, though, is that if Trump comes to office, this leaves Europeans in a bind with war unfolding 500 miles from Berlin. I mean, this is the distance from San Francisco to San Diego. With war unfolding 500 miles from Berlin, and the sense that Trump might be a kind of ally of Putin's, are European officials going to be willing to share intelligence with Trump? I mean, this really is a real question. And just this immediate question also raises the broader issue, I would say, that even if Trump loses, there's this sense that America is only one election away from this kind of event happening once again. And so there's a degree to which Europeans, I think, increasingly ask, maybe we need to hedge our risks here and start looking for allies elsewhere. And I think, personally, I'm the director of the Center for European Studies, but I think more generally as an American, this is certainly a major risk for the United States when we're not regarded as an ally, because this undercuts our kind of core interests and kind of the sense that we have this shared community. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is John Githongo. I'm not an academic, so my background is in media and anti-corruption work, and so I'll endeavor to give some context of African relations with the U.S., where we are now, and what's happening within the continent that is defining that relationship. In June this year, I happened to be on the streets in Kenya when we had some massive protests in about 40 out of 47 counties or mini states within the country, led by youth, Generation Z youth. And the demonstrations were so massive and so widespread and so organic that the president was forced to dismiss his entire cabinet of ministers, to reappoint new ones, and to make a whole host of other changes. The primary complaints of the young people in Kenya were the same as what we are seeing and witnessing in other parts of Africa, especially in the Sahel, where we've had a number of coups that generally have the support of young people. Young people are ambivalent or even supportive of the changes. It's about bad governance, about corruption, about elections that are increasingly unsuccessful. Democracy isn't delivering. And the opinion polls that the research that I refer to is by Afrobarometer, which is available online, and the Ichkovitz Foundation out of South Africa, who poll African youth attitudes. And I'm also aware of the work that Pew have done. And as attitudes have shifted in Africa over the last just 18 years, African youth increasingly believe that democracy is the best system for governing the continent, but democracy increasingly does not deliver. And that has led to a change in attitudes to the point that I would say that the U.S. is increasingly in trouble on the African continent. We've seen a number of countries like Chad and Niger where U.S. troops have been expelled from the continent, or relations have broken down to the extent that the troops have to leave. Out of countries where we have large ungoverned territories where terrorism is a big problem. I started with this sort of reflection on my experience on the streets in Kenya, because by 2100, 30% of the world's population will be African. 50% of the world's young people will be African. And their perceptions of the United States have changed fairly dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. And now the country which enjoys the most positive perceptions in terms of, and has a model of development that people are looking to, surprisingly, is China. The US is still leading in the polls. One looks at Afrobarometer and the Ichkovitz Foundation. But those perceptions are changing and changing fairly rapidly on the continent, which is interesting, especially considering that the US across Africa and its model of governance has been, I think you call it here, the shining house on the hill in terms of a model that is open, that is free, and that people would want to emulate. This change has consequences in terms of it's almost as if the US has woken up and realized that this change has happened, and the Biden administration in particular, coming after the Trump administration, who had very clear views about Africa, has attempted to correct this while also competing so urgently with China. They're doing this in the context of this massive youth bulge on the continent. And these are the healthiest, most educated, most globally connected in terms of just information technology generation in African history. And they're also expressing the most sharpest moral clarity we've had since the struggle for independence across Africa in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They're very clear about international affairs and what they consider to be right and to be wrong. Well, the US has traditionally always had the best infrastructure for elite influence in Africa, whether it's the State Department, its myriad of programs to the media, Hollywood. The US has traditionally had the best infrastructure for exerting soft power, and this has had a tremendous impact. When one looks at the statistics, though, just simple statistics like the number of students going to university in the US from Africa and going to China. 2018, 81,000 students from sub-Saharan Africa in Chinese universities. Last year, African students coming into the US, 57,000. And those figures between 2015 and just 2018, the figures of students going into China rose by about 60%. So it's, this tremendous, quiet, very effective investment. And this is having a profound impact in the way Africans perceive the US and global affairs. I'm not going to pretend that Africans think very much about US elections, but US is the US, and everyone has an opinion on what's happening here. And they're followed in the sense that we know who the competitors are. I would say the European statistics in terms of who supports what would be mirrored a little bit for much of Africa. As I said, Mr. Trump has got his attitude towards Africa and the quote-unquote shithole countries, and that affects attitudes on the continent. However, there is a small and strong committed group that supports Mr. Trump, and that is especially amongst the evangelicals who find considerable track with him. In terms of some of the issues that have had a lot of resonance on the African continent, my background is in media. Interestingly, recently it was Mr. Biden stepping down as president of the United States. That was very surprising. You know, in some countries, people say that's completely outrageous. Why would somebody, you know, with no gun to his head, accept to step down because he's got telephone calls and that kind of thing? So these are the kind of things that impact. I mean, this is really American democracy at its best. And for me, coming into the U.S., watching the presidential debate between candidate Harris and Mr. Trump, it's one of the reflections that I've had repeatedly, and one hears amongst policymakers on the African continent as things change and Africa feels, okay, we're not that important to the US at a time when Africa is young and precocious, ambitious, well-educated, healthy. People say, okay, if the US isn't that interested in relations with us, we're going to look elsewhere. And it's clear that sometimes the US doesn't actually have an idea of how important democracy in the US is to democracy around the world. That actually democracy is precarious. You know, we all talk of democratic backsliding. It's around the world, and this is the year of democracy, 4 billion people going to the polls. And, you know, it's gone well in countries like South Africa. It's gone well in India, better than people had anticipated. And of course, we are waiting to see what happens here. Because what happens here sets a tone for democratic expression around the world. Sometimes we feel the US doesn't really appreciate that if it goes wrong here, candidates refuse to accept the results, people storm Congress, that kind of thing, which some of us are more used to than others. That has a huge impact on lots of leaders who are a lot less democratically inclined, saying, well, you know, this is more of a rationale for us to hold on to quite autocratic ways. We are going through, in terms of the defining issues, and I'm talking to policymakers. I was in New York last week, just talking to some of my colleagues there. One of the defining issues for the African continent in the coming 36 months is debt. Africa has got about $1.1 trillion of debt. 30% of that is multilateral, World Bank, IMF, etc. But 43% is owed to private players and bondholders, and about 23% to bilaterals. 3/4 of Africans pay more in interest payments than to health and education. And every single state house, every single government office one visits where people are involved in managing financial affairs, this is the discussion. What is the US's posture around the way this debt is going to be managed and the environment? And there are a few countries that are ahead on that. In terms of the elections are coming this year, the one interesting aspect of the US policymaking that has captured the imagination across the continent has been hearings on Capitol Hill by AFRICOM, the security arm of US Army engagement in Africa. And these have expressed a policy that seems to be taking Africa back into a Cold War posture. So between candidate Trump and candidate Harris, these are the choices that people are studying that are going to be made. They said, are we going back to pre-1990 on the African continent, where there's this huge competition between the US and China, and now other actors, the Turkeys and the others, and this is what we are watching on the continent. But as I said, the relationship overall, I think the US is in trouble in Africa. Thank you.
So thank you all for being here. And I will be talking today about India, which is the world's largest democracy. And I just wanted to begin by talking a little about some of the shared ground and connections that India and the US share today and historically. So at 1.5 billion and a democracy since 1947 with a short interregnum of about 2 years, India is very proud to be and is proud to lay claim to be the largest democracy. And of course, the US is the second largest. They are both federal countries. Professor Ziblatt has written a classic book about the conditions under which countries become federal. India is much more centralized in its federalism than the US is. And they have a shared legacy of British colonialism. The US revolution against Britain was an important background for India's nationalist struggle centuries later. They're also highly ethnically diverse. And what I want to point to in particular is India's linguistic diversity, because this will come into play in a second. And in particular, to just draw your attention to the fact that in addition to having different languages, India is a linguistic federation. So the regional lines, the provincial lines of India are drawn on the basis of different languages. And I want to draw your attention there to Tamil, which is there in the kind of southeast of India, which is has always been a very, very proud state, a linguistically proud, what I would call subnationalist state. It is also, in terms of ethnic diversity, both countries have what we would call ranked ethnic systems, and Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste really brought this out. So race in America and caste in India are often considered parallel, analogous, comparable forms of ethnic hierarchies, and also many connections. Evan spoke about the Jewish holidays. As we come upon another one, it's important to keep in mind that, of course, Columbus came to the US looking for India. And I could keep talking about many of these shared connections, but also to point out that there is, going back to the legacy of British colonialism and resistance to it, also many connections. The one that I always love to talk about, especially because we're in New England today, is between Gandhi, who was, of course, the leader of India's nonviolent nationalist movement, was inspired by Thoreau, who wrote here in near Walden, and who Gandhi, in turn, of course, inspired Martin Luther King, going back to the analogy between race and caste, who he said, I'm not making a visit to India. He said, all other countries I visit, India I go as a pilgrim, a devotee. And while he was in India, he was introduced as the head of the untouchable castes in America. And he writes in his writings how he was initially really stunned and actually quite upset at this introduction until he realized a connection that, of course, Du Bois and others have made, which is that the untouchables in India and blacks in America do come from a very similar socioeconomic, cultural context. And so that was a kind of appellation that he then actually accepted and reveled in and made again and again. So coming to the present period, again, we've spoken about the democratic decline and erosion. And the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that India and the US have visited, in some ways, parallel declines in democracy. By many indicators of democracy, India is actually no longer quite a democracy. And it has happened at the hands of parties and leaders that have espoused very resonant forms of exclusionary nationalism that come couched in this working class, populist, underdog rhetoric. So the one way in which India and the US part, and I think that becomes important as we get into the coverage of the US elections in India, is the real decline of the freedom of press and expression more generally in India that I don't think has had quite the same analog in the US, it hasn't been analogous here in the US. And so there have been killings of journalists in daylight. This is a newspaper headline that talks about India being one of the most dangerous countries for journalists, but also imprisonment of journalists. And so the public sphere that you're seeing in India is a highly constricted one. And so when we are talking about the coverage of really anything, we have to kind of keep in mind that the mainstream media, newspapers, television channels, are in many ways almost propaganda machines, and not the kind of raucous, free press that they were even a decade ago. So that's just the context. So the coverage of US elections in India, I always think Indians have a particular way of putting things. And so, of course, that meme blew up when Kamala Harris said, you didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. And I always think that a good analogy to that is that a journalist was talking about, in general, why it is that the US elections are not so covered in the Indian media. And he said, well, we have bigger fish to fry. So that's your kind of coastal metaphor. And the bigger fish to fry, of course, is that India can be a quite inward-looking, and South Asia more broadly. So India has elections of its own coming up in 3 major states, and so that has been a preoccupation for the Indian media. Also, the domestic market is pretty big in India, and so it is very much focused on domestic issues. But, and this links to John's point, the one thing that has received a lot of coverage are presidential debates. And the underlying context to this is this question that Indian commentators ask themselves, can our leaders dare to debate like this? And so the Indian presidential debates were covered in their entirety. Many people that I know watched them with an interest that I can't say I necessarily saw among my friends in the US. And the context for this, again, is that India's present prime minister has not given a press conference for quite a long time now. And so there is this context in which our prime minister does not meet the press, and no press conference, no problem, that when the presidential debates are aired, people, again, talking about how the US makes them reflect on their own politics, say, well, our leaders don't even meet the press. And here these leaders are out there really debating, going after each other. And so what does that mean? The interesting thing is, of course, Prime Minister Modi said he doesn't hold press conferences because he's going to debate in Parliament. And then, of course, when Parliament came around, this is the leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi from the Congress party. And of course, he didn't debate there either. So the presidential debates, the lack thereof, what does it mean for a democracy to hold these debates? What does it mean for a democracy not to hold these debates, has actually been a really lively and quite thoughtful conversation in India. Beyond that, I think we can divide coverage of US elections in India across 2 broad camps. One is a kind of cultural, emotional coverage, and the second is a coverage about which candidate is better for India. The context for this is that if I was to just show you the same Pew data, there is a fair amount of positive coverage of the US. 62% of Indians think think of India in very positive terms, and there is a generally more positive attitude towards the Democrats. Biden actually was quite well supported, and now for Kamala Harris as compared to Trump. So the cultural emotional coverage in a large way has really been about the increasing presence of Indian Americans in the presidential fray, but also more broadly. So, of course, it's not new. This is Bobby Jindal, who had stood for election. Interestingly, I put here all the Republican presidential candidates, because what I won't be talking about, but is obviously very important, is the Indian diaspora here in the US. And here, kind of, somewhat similar to what Katrina spoke about, a historically Democrat-leaning group. But Hindus in India, or I forget exactly what they're called, have now gone ahead and endorsed Trump in the in the upcoming presidential context. And so these are all Indian Americans. Well, that's Usha Vance. So either presidential candidates or wives of presidential candidates. And this has received some emotional cultural coverage in India. Of course, the fact that these are Republican candidates gets to the needle that Indian Americans manage to thread, which is they support the Democrats in the US, but are big supporters of the Hindu nationalist regime in India. And so that's another debate that we can have. But all to say that Trump and Modi have actually had a very close relationship, and that's, again, been covered in the media. But of course, this gets to the whole point, which has, again, received a lot of coverage, which is about Kamala Harris. And so many memes in India, of course, I think the most popular being in Sanskrit, which is true. Kamala means lotus, the flower, and in America, Kamala means potus. Many Indians will tell you this is a meme that actually originated in WhatsApp circles in India, and I certainly got it from my mom well before it became big here. So Kamala Harris has spoken about this walk on the beach in Chennai with her grandfather, how this led her to kind of, have that original democratic impulse, and it led her to call out her chittis. And this, I think, is important. Okay, I'm going to go very quick, because with a word of Tamil, Kamala Harris boosted her fan base in India. So chittis means aunt. It's not a word I'm familiar with because I'm not a Tamil speaker, but this gets to that map that I showed you, which is in many ways Kamala's fan base, the way that she's covered. So regional media in Tamil Nadu has covered Kamala Harris much more than the national media. And this gets to her use of Tamil occasionally. So these are, but they covered her much more in her run-up to the vice presidential election 4 years ago than here, because she hasn't really played up her connection to India. This is her ancestral village, where there is a TV crew now almost permanently stationed. They're definitely big supporters of her. She has her name in the kind of ancestral temple. There are prayers. There's a little cottage industry of kind of Kamala Harris explainers in this little village. And Tamil Nadu, in a book that I had written, these are a very proud, linguistically proud subnationalist people. And so it feels very interesting to me in which when you look at Donald Trump tweeting, you have all these Tamils who will tweet back with, as you can see, really emotionally intense, often at the same emotional mental playing level as him. But you have a lot of these tweets. And so I just want to make the connection between kind of regional importance, regional coverage of the presidential elections. Okay, so very quickly in the last minute, but who is better for India? So even as there is this kind of emotional cultural connect, there is a lobby that says actually Kamala Harris would not be India's best bet. She very gently pushed Modi, and the LA Times called it pushing him gently. The Indian media said he was scolded. And in many ways, there is this sense in India that actually Modi and the present regime would much rather have Trump. So, there are all these coverages, a lot of coverage about how actually it would be better for India if Trump won the elections. But what I want to conclude with is that in some ways, the muted and detached coverage beyond Kamala Harris and the emotional cultural connect, beyond the presidential debates, the fact that it hasn't really been as important a topic in the Indian media gets down to the fact that India in some ways doesn't care. And it doesn't care so much. And much of this gets to the fact that now India is the world's fastest growing economy. It is increasingly influential on the global stage. There was a time when the US could dismiss India as a country famously of snake charmers, magicians, and beggars. Carter visited India, and then no US president visited India and really ignored relations with India for almost 25 years till Bill Clinton began the patch-up. But those days are gone. India feels that it is unprecedentedly important, and for the first time maybe has an upper hand with its relationship with the US, and in many ways that's because of China. And so India is really playing up its kind of China plus one. Who else do you have to turn to but us? It thinks America has lost a lot of legitimacy in scolding or gently chiding it on its human rights record, given the rise of authoritarian tendencies within India, the fact that the Indian diaspora and all of the capital that comes with it actually supports the present regime. And so this is a very different India, which has really played up its strategic multi-alignment, in which it says it's a friend to all and an enemy to none. And so I want to kind of end just with this, because in as much as Trump has embraced Modi, he has essentially embraced everyone. Leaders of the free world to Putin, who he calls a close friend. India continues to import Russian oil. He tweets in favor of Netanyahu, even as the Ministry of External Affairs continues to stick to, we favor a two-state solution. And so I just want to end by saying the kind of lowered stakes of who wins might help us explain or at least understand the way in which the Indian media has covered the US elections. Thank you.
I invite all of you guys to come up inside the stage. Yep. Great. Well, that was a terrific set of presentations. I really enjoyed hearing all of your perspectives. And ironically, I think the conceit of this event was, the U.S. is so important. We're really interested in what all these countries around the world are thinking. And what I've heard from several of you is, America's not as important to us as it once was in lots of ways, or isn't perceived as such. And of course, the shifting dynamics of power in the world are quite profound, and that's not the point that all of you made. But one question that's on my mind, especially it started in my head when I heard Katrina talking about some of the polarization in Latin America, is I guess my question for whoever wants to take it is the polarization that we see coincident with American democracy, or is it somehow caused by it? And clearly in some countries, and maybe most notably in Brazil, right? When we saw Bolsonaro, you couldn't think of him as anything other than, and maybe it's very American lens, but he felt like a Brazilian Trump, right? And we see this with other authoritarians in Europe. And so I guess I'm just wondering about the polarization in views on the American election. Is that somehow caused by people, actors within these various regions for one reason or another, especially taking on a persona of Trump, because he's been a very unique character on the, political playing field, or, trying to look like our, the past Democratic presidents or contenders, whether it's Obama, Biden, or Harris. Any takers on that one?
Well, I guess since you referred to me and to Latin America, I wouldn't go that far. I think that this trend is global and it reflects some global sort of drivers. And a couple that come to mind in the case of Latin America is Latin America has always been very unequal. I think one of the drivers in the United States is we've become so much more unequal. But the inequality is in the context of democratization. And so I think this sort of disillusionment with democracy, what John mentioned, disillusionment with governance, failed governance, that it makes these outsiders very appealing. And then they tend to pull from the same playbook and they learn from each other, but I wouldn't make a causal argument. Again, the US maybe isn't as important as we think it is, that there are these kind of similar dynamics working internally within these countries, but they're responding to similar kinds of phenomena and pressures.
Yeah, I refer to these as parallel and shared problems, because I think it's both, in the sense that there's parallel developments in these countries in Europe and the United States, which are very similar, driving similar outcomes. So increased diversity, slowed economic growth, as I said, changes in technology and so on. These things are happening in lots of places, not just Europe and the United States. And so in that sense, they're kind of independently being driven by these. But it's a shared challenge in the sense that I think they are learning from each other. I mean, I think that Trump, the idea of, I mean, sort of when you can't unlearn the Trump experience in a way. I mean, people look at this and see that was successful and then try to begin to emulate it and copy it. And I really think that I think mostly about the AfD in Germany as really having learned a lot from Trump and Trumpism, and the idea that you can, that these kind of established ways of doing things, that there's real power in assaulting that and saying outrageous things and then stepping back and saying, well, that was misunderstood, I didn't quite mean it that way, or, and this kind of game of breaking down the ways things have been done and appealing to, and the media and the domination of social media. I mean, one of the things that I saw very early on is the AfD, far before any of the other establishment parties, was very early on TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and whatever the relevant social media is. And so, and this came about sort of at the same time. So I do think that these are shared. There's a global phenomena happening, and there is learning taking place.
John, can I ask you? I was fascinated by the finding, first of all, of youth. That you were saying that youth were supporting Trump, and I'm also curious about the role of evangelicals. American evangelicals, highly politicized at the moment in America, and have been very important in Africa, and we've seen the rise. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how they see a connection to Trump.
Yeah, so I don't get into big trouble. Just want to correct.
Yeah.
No, the youth are not supporting Trump.
Oh, okay, sorry. So that, my mistake. Right.
But amongst, and here, the evidence is only when from the media and as you interact with your peers and colleagues. Within the evangelical community, there's a strong strain of those who support not just Trump, because sometimes he says things that are quite embarrassing, but just the Republican kind of right-wing Republican cause. If one goes into countries where those particular groups have been particularly active within elite politics, South Sudan, for example, in Uganda, where laws have been passed criminalizing homosexuality, and a number of other countries, then one will find groups of members of parliament, leaders in civil society and business who are quite supportive of Trump, even though it's not something that everyone admits to very easily in polite company.
And Prerna, great to hear your views about what's going on in India, and again, leaving us with we've got bigger bigger fish to fry, other things to focus on. But I am curious again. You talked about the relationship with the caste cleavage in India, and so and there's also, and you also talked about Hindu nationalism. And I wonder if you have any sense, maybe you don't have data on it, but maybe you have any sense on either of those. Is there, for instance, caste differences in India on views of our candidates? And then relatedly, where you have this Muslim minority that feels, quite under siege at the moment with Modi, is there a Muslim perspective on the American election?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Great and tough questions as always. I think where caste really comes is in some ways, vis-a-vis the US elections, is in the Indian diaspora. And I think, all the candidates that I put up there for you, and pretty much every candidate I could have put up for you, every Indian American CEO of a Silicon Valley company that I could have put up for you, is high caste, if not Brahmin. And I think it deserves to be noted that the kind of anti-caste bill in California came out of a lot of reportage about caste-based discrimination within the kind of hallowed halls of Silicon Valley and Google and Apple. And so I think, it is, the Hindu nationalist movement is not just a religious, it's not just a Hindu nationalist movement, it's also a high caste movement. It was a party that was traditionally an upper caste trader, petty shopkeeper party. That was its support base. It has tried to diversify that a lot and has tried to reach out to lower caste groups. But I think the appeal of Hindu nationalism is an appeal of a kind of religious caste-based identity. I think it also explains why the Indian diaspora, while being democratic, though like Katrina, that's shifting, support the BJP back home. So I think it really allows us to kind of understand, in a way, what might initially strike you as a bit of a paradox. But so I think that's where caste and religion, and Christoph Jaffrelot, who I think is a very sharp observer of Indian politics, has always said that caste and religion are this dialectic for Hindu nationalists. And just to say that I'm not sure that we have any, so that kind of survey data is always harder to get for India. And in particular to make it a kind of nationally representative sample. And so I think that where I would necessarily see potential differences might be, again, on provincial lines. Gender, we haven't really spoken about gender, but I think the patriarchy of Trump was very appealing to Indian patriarchy. And I think that I've spoken about kind of caste and religion, but patriarchy, that's the third component of Hindu nationalism and of a lot of these exclusionary right-wing populist regimes across the world. And so I'd be interested actually to see more about what the kind of gender breakup of support for these regimes in India and in the US is.
Great. Well, we'd love to turn to some questions from the audience. We have microphones on either side there. So I know that there are some of you with burning questions for one or more or all of our panelists. So if you wouldn't mind lining up behind those. Great, you can just stand right there, and if people line up and go one after the other, but we'll start with you, sir.
Yeah, my name is Leroy Stoddard. We all remember the excitement around the world with the election of Barack Obama as president, what it meant to people of color all around the world, and I think what it meant about American democracy. That was 16 years ago. Does Kamala Harris's African descent carry any of the weight that Obama's did, and does her gender carry a different weight that might have appeal around the world that you're not seeing? We heard about the Tamil connection, and that's real, but she is a woman of color, and she's a woman. So please comment on that.
Prerna, do you want to start maybe?
Yeah, those are great questions. So it's a bit of a, again, they're like, as soon as you talk India, you begin to use the word paradox, contradictory very often. But even as I spoke about India as being, and it truly is, a deeply patriarchal country, it's also a country that's had no problem electing female leaders from its very beginning. So women were very prominent in India's nationalist struggle. India had a female prime minister with no big deal at all in the 1970s. It has had chief ministers, including very, very powerful chief ministers of the state of Tamil Nadu who are women. And so, there have been bills to have reserved seats for women in parliament. Seats are reserved for women for local elections. And so I think that Indians are always Indians also love being a little bit righteous. And so how dare America tell us? And that's where I think the democratic decline in America has been very dangerous in India, because they've lost any kind of moral high ground to be able to kind of, because the Indian regime, the Hindu nationalist regime, at least in its first iteration, came to power with a huge popular mandate. And so for a lot of people on the left who did not support the regime, it seemed as if America would be the one that would kind of put pressure on India to release some of the journalists, to not have this erosion of liberalism and the kind of attack on the free press. But America lost that legitimacy very quickly. And I think with the Kamala Harris being a woman, they're almost like, oh, how cute that they're still fighting this battle when we've had a female leader. Of course, that doesn't absolve them for the fact that India is also one of the most dangerous places to be a woman. killed before you're born. And so I think her being a woman isn't really an issue, but it's more that it's notable that it is an issue in the US.
John, any thoughts?
I mean, I'm a bit subjective. Barack Obama has Kenyan roots, so he was a rock star across the African continent. And Kamala Harris, exciting, but not on the same scale at all. She hosted a democracy summit in Lusaka, Zambia last year. It got a bit of reportage, but not very much. So the excitement level isn't the same, which is also a factor of the fact that American media in Africa has been in terminal decline for the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. So where, say, Time magazine had maybe 10 correspondents across Africa by 1990, maybe they have one on the African continent or two. Washington Post, New York Times, the same. So it's also because people are only capturing this information and news from social media. It's not reported in the kind of structured way that we saw with Barack Obama, where there are all these long stories and colorful documentaries, etc., on him when he came out. But as I said, I'm a Kenyan, so very subjective. You're asking the wrong person.
Okay. No, that's exactly the right person. But you guys have any thoughts on?
Well, just that I think it's a little bit like the U.S. in the sense that there's just a sense of relief that there's a possibility that Donald Trump won't be the president, whoever it is. And so I think in a way that the experience of Trumpism has tainted, has poisoned the water in a way. I mean, I think there was a way in which Obama was regarded as the culmination of this evolution of American democracy, and so it had this incredible significance. Whereas this is sort of like, we've made it past this. One other thing, though, I wanted to say, what I think that's interesting in thinking about the comparison to India is how, the degree to which Europeans feel. I mean, I've had so many people say to me, we should have a right to vote in the American elections because it affects us so much, and I've had many people say this to me. So there's a real sense of that we almost need to vote because this is going to affect our lives. And so it's really the opposite kind of dynamic with India and what's also interesting about this is given the Indian diaspora in the United States, there is more of a kind of connection of people, in politics. Europeans, there's of course many European immigrants to the US and recently European immigrants, it's not of the same scale. And so it's this kind of interesting thing where it's, I think, just really these security relations, these trade relations are the thing that are really panicking people, and they feel like, if it's too bad we can't vote too. I mean, that's really the sense that I get.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say for Latin America, they're somewhat similar to particularly India. On the one hand, also a very patriarchal society. I think some of the support for Trump is driven by this sort of motivation. But on the other hand, I think Obama's victory and arrival in the presidency, I happened to be in Cuba at the same time he was visiting in 2016, and the conversations that we were having with taxi drivers, they were just so amazed that a black man was actually elected in the United States. I mean, it was really palpable. I think for Kamala Harris, it's a little bit old news because he was first. I think her status as a woman, however, it's really resonating in Mexico. And Mexico just inaugurated its first female president ever. And so I have a lot of, and this is very anecdotal, but a lot of my friends in Mexico are really excited about the possibility that both countries will be led by women in a very historic way. So I think there is the gender component of her identity is resonating kind of powerfully, certainly in Mexico, if not beyond.
Great. We have a question here.
Hi, I'm Grace Cargill. I'm a reporter for the Huntington News at Northeastern. This question can kind of go for anybody. Some of you said that your regions didn't necessarily care that much in their media, or that the U.S. was no longer really like a democracy to watch for influence, but there definitely was a time and a point in history that the U.S. democracy was the democracy to watch in terms of the powers and how they ran things. So just wondering for anybody up here on the panel, do you think that the U.S.'s democracy has lost its respect in the global sphere? And do you think that it's too far gone in terms of like being ahead of the curve? Or do you think that there is a world where we can get back what we have lost?
Anyone want to? I'll be democratic. Anyone want to choose that one?
Well, one thing I'll say, and as I spend a lot of time talking to Europeans about all of the institutional flaws of American democracy and so when I'm in front of American audiences and say, we need to have proportional representation, we should get rid of the Electoral College, we should have term limits for judges, we should get rid of the filibuster. People go, this is radical, this will never happen. And then you go to Europe and people just yawn because it's like, of course you should get rid of that stuff. I mean, why do you have it? It's so commonsensical and everybody has it. So I think there's a sense in which, if we could get through this trouble, and we could carry out these kinds of reforms, I think there would be there is room for kind of respect of, the endurance and the resilience. And I guess one other thing is I think that one thing where people do still respond positively, I think, about American democracy in Europe, anyway, is the kind of sense that the U.S. is a multi-ethnic democracy and is more and deals with these issues in a much more sophisticated way than European democracies do. So I think there is a sense that the U.S. still kind of is a role model in that regard. So that's something, and we've seen all the backlash against that and so on. And so that takes away some of the luster. But I think, if we can get through these kinds of our own crises, there is the possibility that the U.S. could be a role model in this respect.
And John, I don't know how you'd feel about this, but I mean, while I certainly agree that China has become such a looming alternative to the United States for people in Africa and people in other regions, for people who say, as many do in Africa, that democracy is still the best alternative, I don't know that there is any model of democracy that they look to more than the American case. Do you think that's fair?
That's fair. I don't think there is. There are frustrations with, American democracy and American foreign policy as it is expressed in, quote unquote, the global South, parts of Africa, is very different. Some of America's best friends in developing countries are not Democrats. There are people who are doing extremely bad things to their citizens, and so that is a perspective that you've got to adopt. I mean, American democracy, the American model, was at its peak in 1990, fall of the Berlin Wall. In Africa, between 1989 and 1994, about 50 countries adopted multi-party politics, changed the constitutions, introduced term limits for heads of state. It was the most dramatic change. And the U.S., the U.S. aid offices across the continent were doing consultancy. It's an incredible time. So yes, the U.S. has played that role. I think what has been degraded somewhat by events within the U.S., but also especially the actions of U.S. friends and what they seem to be allowed to do, is just the legitimacy of the model has been degraded. No, you won't bump into many people in African capitals who are saying, okay, we think the CCP is going to be the model for which we should govern ourselves for the next 50 years. We haven't reached that point yet. It's just that this shining house on the hill is not as beautiful as it was 20 years ago. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. I have a question that relates to the global regard of American democracy in the context of global leadership. So I think we as an American populace sort of presume American leadership on the global stage, but I'm curious if the presidential election is perhaps inciting doubt into constituencies in, say, the global South especially, as to the merits of American leadership on the global stage, and perhaps move to a more multipolar world in which leaders such as, from Singapore or small states that have had more consistent governance over the past decades, even if they're not democracies, but have had relatively consistent governance, whether they will be given opportunities to play larger leadership roles in the context of global affairs.
I've been involved in anti-corruption work for 30 years now, and I was, working with Transparency International in Kenya from a very early stage, and we had a big reflection last year, 30 years after I got involved in this, and we've made tremendous strides. We still have a major corruption problem around the world, and it is the models that we've had to reflect that actually some of the greatest successes in reversing major corruption problems, are places like Singapore, in countries in Africa, a country like Rwanda, etc., etc. Unfortunately, some of the countries that have made some of the governance changes that seem to impact livelihoods of the poorest in society have a far more control-oriented model, for lack of a better way of putting it. And yes, people are beginning to say, okay, hold on, especially when you have societies where a lot of people have died violently. A leader or leaders who can stop that are given a lot of leeway. And when they do a good job, yes, they are studied. It's a controversial topic because when I got involved in anti-corruption work was end of the Cold War, we all were very excited. I'm still at heart total Democrat, but I have to listen to those voices that are saying, hold on, is this working for everyone in the same way? Thing is, it doesn't. So how do we fine-tune it? Then we come to the US, they are also fine-tuning this giant that we have been copying. But I think that there are lessons. I think one of the things we have learned is that there are lessons to be learned from every society and from every experience. And those societies that were seen poorer, less democratic, or just very different, that were not seen as legitimate, we have to accept in some areas they're very legitimate. Some of what they have been able to do in terms of education, health, for the poorest people in their societies cannot be ignored.
Thank you. My name's Tom Cadella. The question I have is why is South America just a totally forgotten area? Is siding with Harris? It just doesn't add up. They're used to, as you just described, the poor people that are inflicted in so many different ways. They look to strong people for change. And I've only heard from my resources that Latin Americans are in favor of Trump for that reason. And they want the strong person, not so much because of Trump, but because that's what they've seen all their lives with the different presidents that have come in and so forth. And corruption is what kind of attracts that. So when I saw your numbers there, I had a hard time believing it.
All right, let me, a couple of things. One is I think Latin Americans are a little bit more sophisticated, and it varies a lot from one country to another, what sort of political traditions they have, how much of a kind of strongman phenomenon has been prevalent in different countries. So that would be the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is I think the one, neglect, and two, toxic rhetoric about people from Latin America paints Trump in a very negative light. Also, the fact that he's willing to use trade and investment and aid to basically pursue a very one-issue agenda of controlling migration doesn't play well in the Americas, particularly since it's no longer just about Mexicans coming to the United States. I mean, the 8 million Venezuelans have left their country in the last 10 years, and they're spread around South America. More of them are in South America than are coming to the United States. And so I think they also feel that Trump is going to be a much less helpful partner in trying to figure out how to manage this displacement in South America than the Harris administration will be, at least at the margins. Because Trump is essentially, his agenda is just relocate the problem south of the border. And we don't care how those countries deal with it. We don't, it's. So I think this sort of make America great. First of all, America is the Americas, and then this kind of very inward-focused orientation of the Trump administration in a region that is so incredibly interdependent with the United States. It doesn't play well for a lot of people in Latin America. There's support for Trump. Right? And for example, Brazilians are also particularly inclined to support Trump. Brazilians in the United States, the Bolsonaro effect, I think, is real. It's strong. I suspect Salvadorans are quite, sort of inclined to lean toward Trump, in part because of their experience with an autocratic leader who has controlled crime very successfully, and they can sort of see the similarities between Trump and Bukele. So it's quite nuanced and complex, I think. But those are some of the reasons that I would suggest why Trump is less popular than Harris, or Biden-Harris in most of Latin America.
Great. So I see two more people with questions. I'm going to ask to take both of those questions and then ask each of you to respond to whichever of those questions you feel like you can, and anything else you want to add in response to what you heard from each other this evening. So let's hear those.
Hello, this is Sebastian from Switzerland, spending a sabbatical here with my family in Harvard. And you described, thank you very much for all the insights, you described very much the US may less be the shining house of the hill, less of a kind of the role model for democracy. So for you, representing important educational institutions, can you already see an impact of that some people around the world, the smartest people around the world, have less of an interest to come to the United States? Because that's, seen from the outside, I think that's what the success of the country is built on a lot, right? So is that already tangible for you, that some people may say who would have previously, I go to MIT or Harvard, but they say, well, wait a second, I mean, maybe it's not that shining house of the hill, I consider alternatives, so the impact on the educational system.
It's kind of interesting that my question is linked to that issue about educational institutions. It seems to me that the respect for American institutions, higher education, is still very strong around the world. And the number of students, if you look at the Pew Research at the number of international students coming, it still remains pretty high, though there's some variation. The question I have is, in this kind of debates about elections and democracy, how does this kind of thing that we watched in American universities recently, these big demonstrations against the war, or even earlier during the Vietnam War, does it make the universities look more democratic or less democratic?
Great. Thank you for those questions. And so, as I said, it'd be great as we're almost out of time to hear from each of you responding to those questions about educational institutions or any other reflections you might have had on the evening. Daniel, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so two very good questions have given me a lot to think about. Actually, before this presentation, one of the things I was looking up was the number of Germans who spend their time a year in high school in the United States. I couldn't find it, but my impression is, at least among university-educated Germans, it's an incredibly high percentage of Germans have spent a year living with a family in some place like Oklahoma or Maine or Texas and have this deep connection. And that's partly why people feel like they should have a vote. So I remember that when there was an attack, when there was a Trump assault on the protesters at some point during the Trump presidency, I was being interviewed by a German journalist, and she was in tears saying, if this can't, how is this happening? And really taking these things personally. So I think that the educational connections are not only at the university level, but the high school level have been an incredible success. And so I think at the university level as well, I mean, they continue to be regarded as the top universities in the world. And so I think that's a great success. I guess on the second point, I could say a lot more, but I'll be just brief to allow my colleagues here to speak. The German setting is particularly interesting with regards to the student protests, because I think Germans are very conflicted and confused, I would even say, about how to interpret this, because in the German setting, the kind of commitment to Israel is essential, is part of, sort of post-war German identity, and so the kind of, left-right issues and, pro-Israel, anti-Semitism become very complicated, and I think they have real difficulty even understanding the nature of the conflict here, and so, I think it's very much interpreted as, any kind of criticism of Israel is interpreted as anti-Semitism in Germany, and much more often is the case. And so I think there's real fear of what's happened at a lot of American universities. And from my perspective, a bit of a misunderstanding of what's been happening on American campuses. But one final thing I'll just say is that I think one of the things I most fear about a Trump presidency is the assault on American universities, or the potential assault on American universities. And as a kind of bulwark of autonomy, of professionalism, of power, prestige, it's an alternative to a Trump presidency. And so, this is one of our institutions that continues to work well, and we need to do everything we can to defend them.
Yeah, so I teach at the Fletcher School, which is a graduate school of international relations, and about 50% of our students are international. And we have definitely seen the effects of, I think, the Trump effect on international students and where they are choosing to go. I mean, a lot of it's financial, but it's also this, you know, the shabbier house on the hill, but also concerns about visas, yeah. Right? And it had a huge, it's actually still, we have students who can't get in, who were coming to the Fletcher School and still haven't arrived because of visa issues. Under the Trump administration, it got much more complicated. I think people are worried that that's going to happen again. So I think there's actually a real effect for a school like mine. And then on the protests, I think in Latin America, my sense is there's a lot of solidarity, particularly among young people in Latin America. And in fact, that Pew poll suggested that one of the reasons there's less trust of Biden in Latin America is because they don't approve of how he's handled the Gaza war. And just in conversations, I think they sort of see themselves reflected in the protests in the US campuses very, very much, and there's really a sense of sort of solidarity with Palestine. It's quite strong in Latin America.
John? Or Prerna, you can.
So quick responses. I mean, I think, so Indians constitute a large majority of the students who come, and I'm not sure that the Swiss sensibility necessarily transfers. I mean, the interesting thing is many of them come to institutes like MIT for engineering, and it's interesting because the students who are coming now to these institutions, and that has not dropped with Trump, it's maintained pretty steady, are learning a very different kind of history in India and are being schooled very differently in India than a generation before them. Because one of the things that the Hindu nationalist government has done has really molded education systems. And so major attack on universities, particularly liberal arts institutions, because they were seen as the hub of protest. Support for engineering institutions, such as the MIT, because they were seen as more apolitical. And also, I think in many ways, Trump has not come down on H-1B visas. And so that migration issue, they think of him as xenophobic and anti-migration when it comes to Latin Americans. But Indian immigration to India has always been skilled immigration. And so that brain drain continues. And in many ways, the attack on Indian universities has been serious and will have profound consequences. And we are already seeing it in school education because, as I said, the undergraduates who are coming to MIT now will learn a very different history of India, in which Mughals, they don't learn about Mughal history as much. They're described as foreign invaders rather than a dynasty. India's colonialism is not just British colonialism. It is now a much longer history of colonialism. There is Mughal colonialism, and this links to a kind of underlying and very powerful strand of Islamophobia that in many ways links the present Hindu nationalist project in India to the kind of project in Israel. And so it's interesting because India too historically has had a very powerful solidarity with Palestine as kind of post-colonial countries, had an embassy for Palestine, and the Ministry of External Affairs continues to support a two-state solution, even as there has been, India is one of Israel's largest importers of weapons. And so at a personal level, the Prime Minister tweets from his individual account to support Bibi Netanyahu. They're said to have a very warm personal relationship. And so, there are these kind of contradictory moves, but again, a lot of kind of Indian students in Indian universities that are also facing many constraints on their freedom, looking to US liberal arts institutions and seeing the protests there and kind of remembering a shining house on the hill that also made space for protest in the 60s. And so there are all of these, many parallel and shared events that are happening at once.
Right. John?
No, I think I agree with the sentiment that's emerging. In the sense one gets in Africa very strongly that in terms of those basic freedoms, especially freedom for people to protest, to express themselves, etc., really, there's a strong sense of solidarity amongst the young people on issues, whether it's the war in Gaza, etc. The sentiments are very much mirrored. And so one gets that sense that, it's still very much appreciated to see that Well, I mean, I sensed it when I was in New York last week. In one corner there was Falun Gong. There was people who are supporting the government in Israel, all in one corner. It's one of the things that makes America strong and makes people admire it.
Thanks for that, one nice note of optimism about America. And as a director of Center for International Studies, I'm so glad to have people like John Gatango come here. I don't think we had to wrest you away from, some other country to come. You were willing.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's really, it's a pleasure for us to host people from around the world and to engage the perspectives of experts on international studies. The four of you did such a great job today. I'm so grateful for your insights and grateful to all of you. There was a lot of great questions today. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our four speakers.
Thank you.